The massive chamber of the Galactic Council buzzed with tension as representatives from 12 different species gathered for an emergency session. The dome-shaped room stretched hundreds of meters across, its walls made of crystalline material that shifted colors with the mood of the occupants. Today, those walls pulsed with deep reds and angry oranges. Ambassador Thane of the reptilian hegemony stood at the central podium, his scaled skin gleaming under the artificial lights. His yellow eyes swept across the assembled delegates before, settling on the lone human representative sitting in the newest section of the chamber. The human section had been added only 50 years ago, when Earth first made contact with the galactic community. "Fellow members of the Council," Thane began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen 3 centuries of galactic politics. "We face an unprecedented threat to the stability our ancestors worked so hard to achieve." "High Counselor." Vorn of the Silicon Collective nodded from his position near the chamber's edge. His crystalline body caught the light and scattered it in rainbow patterns across the floor. "The data speaks for itself," Vorn said, his voice creating harmonics that translated through the chamber's universal communication system. "In just 200 years, the humans have expanded from 1 world to 47 colonies. Their rate of growth exceeds anything we have seen in recorded history." Director Adams sat quietly in the human section, her hands folded in her lap. She was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too many late nights dealing with galactic politics. She wore the simple blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, a stark contrast to the elaborate robes and biomechanical enhancements of the other species. "The hegemony has maintained peace for over 3,000 years, Thane continued, his forked tongue flicking out as he spoke. "We have done so through careful balance, through respect for established territories, and through the understanding that rapid expansion leads to conflict." The chamber's atmosphere grew heavier as more species voiced their concerns. The Avian Confederacy's representative, a being with metallic feathers and 6 arms, spoke of trade routes being disrupted. The Aquatic Federation complained about mining operations in systems they considered sacred. One by one, the established powers of the galaxy voiced their fears about humanity's relentless growth. "Director Adams," Thane said, turning his attention to the human representative, "your species has been welcomed into our community with open arms. We have shared our technology, our knowledge, and our friendship. Yet you continue to expand your territory without consulting the Council?" Adams stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She had learned early in her diplomatic career that every gesture was analyzed and interpreted by species that had been studying body language for millennia. "Ambassador Thane, with respect, humanity has followed all established protocols for colonization. We have claimed no inhabited worlds, we have avoided all protected systems, and we have respected the boundaries set by existing treaties. But at what cost?" demanded the representative from the Fungal Collective, a being that looked like a walking tree with glowing spores drifting around its branches. "Your expansion rate suggests preparation for something larger. Are you planning to challenge the established order?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Adams could feel the weight of thousands of years of galactic history pressing down on her shoulders. She knew that every species in the chamber had their own story of expansion, conquest, and the wars that followed. The current peace had been built on the ashes of conflicts that had nearly destroyed entire civilizations. "The Council has reached a decision," Thane announced, his voice carrying the finality of a judge passing sentence. "Humanity will cease all expansion beyond your current 47 worlds. You will submit to regular inspections of your military capabilities. You will share all technological developments with the Council before implementation." The chamber fell silent except for the low hum of the translation systems. Adams felt the eyes of hundreds of beings focused on her, waiting for her response. She had expected this moment would come eventually, but the reality of it still sent a chill down her spine. "And if we refuse?" Adams asked, though she already knew the answer. Vorn's crystalline form resonated with a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "Then you will face the combined military might of the Galactic Council. 12 species, thousands of worlds, fleets that have kept peace for millennia. Your expansion will end one way or another. Adams looked around the chamber, studying the faces of beings who had become familiar over her years of service. She had shared meals with some of them, negotiated trade agreements with others, and even developed what she thought were friendships. Now they looked at her with the cold calculation of predators, deciding whether she represented a threat. "I need time to consult with my government," Adams said finally. "This decision affects not just me, but all of humanity." "You have 24 hours, Thane replied. "The Council will reconvene tomorrow at this same time. You will provide your answer then." As the session ended and the various species began to file out of the chamber, Adams remained seated. She watched as groups formed and reformed, as whispered. Conversations took place in corners as alliances that had existed for centuries were quietly reinforced. She was witnessing the machinery of galactic politics at work, and she was struck by how similar it was to the power games that had played out on Earth for thousands of years. The chamber gradually emptied until only Adams remained. She sat in the silence, surrounded by the history and tradition of galactic civilization. The crystalline walls had shifted to a neutral blue, but she could still feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. She activated her personal communication device and sent a priority message to Earth. The quantum entanglement communicators would ensure that her words reached the World Council within minutes. Despite the thousands of light years that separated her from home, "Mr. President," she said into the device, "we need to talk. The galaxy just gave us an ultimatum, and I think it's time we told them the truth about why we've been expanding so quickly." As she left the chamber, Adams couldn't shake the feeling that the next 24 hours would determine the fate of not just humanity, but the entire galaxy. The decision she would have to make would challenge everything the Council believed. About peace, about expansion, and about the nature of the threats that lurked in the darkness between the stars. The Galactic Council chamber was even more crowded than it had been the day before. Word of the ultimatum had spread throughout the galaxy, and representatives from minor species and trade organizations had arrived to witness what many believed would be humanity's submission to the established order. The crystalline walls reflected the tension in the room. Shifting between deep purples and electric blues, Director Adams entered the chamber exactly on time, carrying a small data tablet and wearing the same simple blue uniform she had worn the day before. Her expression was calm, almost serene, which surprised many of the assembled delegates who had expected to see fear or anger. She walked to the human section with steady steps, acknowledging the other representatives with polite nods. Ambassador Thane called the session to order. His scaled features arranged in what his species considered a diplomatic expression. "Director Adams, the Council awaits your response to yesterday's ultimatum. Will humanity accept the terms for continued peaceful coexistence?" Adams stood and walked to the central podium, her movements unhurried. She placed her data tablet on the speaking platform and looked out at the assembled representatives. The chamber fell silent except for the low hum of the translation systems and the barely audible breathing of hundreds of different species. "Honorable members of the Galactic Council," Adams began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "Yesterday, Ambassador Thane asked a question that has echoed through the halls of power on Earth for the past 24 hours. He asked if we were planning to challenge the established order." She paused, letting her words sink in. Several representatives leaned forward in their seats, anticipating either defiance or capitulation. "But before I answer that question, I have one for you." Adams looked directly at Thane, then swept her gaze across the assembled delegates. "You want war?" The question hit the chamber like a physical blow. Whispers erupted in dozens of languages, and the translation system struggled to keep up with the sudden flood of commentary. High Counselor Vorn's crystalline form resonated with discordant notes, while the Avian Confederacy's representative ruffled his metallic feathers in agitation. "Because if you want war," Adams continued, raising her voice slightly to be heard, "over the commotion, then let us show you what war truly means." Thane's yellow eyes narrowed dangerously. "Director Adams, are you threatening the Council?" "No, Ambassador," Adams replied, her voice steady. "I'm offering you a gift, the gift of perspective." She activated her data tablet, and the chamber's central display system came to life. Images began to appear in the air above the assembled delegates, holographic projections that showed scenes of devastation and conflict. The images were clearly from Earth's history, but they were unlike anything the galactic community had ever seen. The first image showed a city in ruins, its buildings reduced to rubble and its streets filled with smoke. "This is what we call the Siege of Stalingrad," Adams explained. "A single battle that lasted over 200 days and cost the lives of nearly 2 million beings." The image changed to show massive metal vehicles belching smoke and fire. "These are what we called tanks. We built them to destroy other tanks, and we used them to level entire cities when necessary." More images followed in rapid succession. Aerial bombardments that turned forests into moonscapes. Naval battles that consumed entire fleets. Underground tunnel systems where soldiers fought with knives and bare hands for control of a few meters of dirt. "This is our history," Adams said, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on the entire chamber. "For thousands of years, we fought wars that consumed entire continents. We developed weapons that could destroy cities in seconds. We created strategies that turned civilian populations into military targets." The images shifted to show more recent conflicts. Guerrilla warfare in dense jungles. Urban combat in ruined cities. Cyber warfare that could cripple entire civilizations without firing a shot. "We learned to fight dirty," Adams continued. "We learned to sacrifice territory to gain advantage. We learned that sometimes the only way to win a war is to make your enemy understand that the cost of fighting you is higher than the cost of leaving you alone." The chamber was completely silent now. Even the translation system seemed to be holding their breath. The assembled delegates stared at the images with a mixture of horror and fascination. "But we also learned something else," Adams said, and the images changed again. This time they showed scenes of reconstruction. Cities being rebuilt, former enemies working together, international organizations dedicated to preventing future conflicts. "We learned that war is not something you win. It's something you survive. And the only way to truly survive war is to understand what causes it and work to prevent it." She deactivated the display and looked out at the assembled delegates. "You asked if we were planning to challenge the established order. The answer is no. We've been preparing to defend it." High Counselor Vorn's crystalline form shimmered with confusion. "Defend it from what?" Adams activated her tablet again, and new images appeared in the chamber. These were not historical records, but recent sensor data from humanity's deep space. Observation networks? The images showed dark regions of space where stars had once shone. Energy signatures that moved in patterns too organized to be natural phenomena. "Our expansion hasn't been random," Adams explained. "We've been building a network of observation posts, manufacturing centers, and defensive installations. We've been preparing for something that our deep space telescopes detected 3 years ago." The images showed massive structures moving through the void between galaxies, their surfaces gleaming with unnatural light. They were clearly artificial, but they were unlike anything in the galactic database. "We call them the Void Fleet," Adams said. "They're not from our galaxy, and based on the energy signatures we're detecting, they're not interested in diplomacy." The chamber erupted in questions and exclamations. Representatives demanded to know why humanity hadn't shared this information earlier, why they had kept their observations secret, why they had been allowed to expand without revealing their true purpose. "Because we weren't sure," Adams replied, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Because we hoped we were wrong. Because we've learned that sometimes the best way to prepare for war is to do it quietly, without causing panic." Ambassador Thane stood slowly, his reptilian features showing the strain of processing this new information. "How long do we have?" Adams looked at her tablet, checking the latest sensor readings that had been transmitted from Earth. "Based on their current velocity and trajectory, They'll reach the outer rim of our galaxy in approximately 18 months. The chamber fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of beings coming to terms with their mortality. The established order that had maintained peace for millennia was about to face something that had no interest in negotiation. Number, respect for territorial boundaries, and no understanding of the delicate balance that held galactic civilization together. "So I ask you again," Adam said, her voice carrying across the silent chamber, "you want war? Because war is coming whether we want it or not. The question is whether we're going to face it together, or whether we're going to waste time fighting each other while our real enemy approaches." She gathered her data tablet and prepared to leave the podium. "The Council has a decision to make. But remember, we humans have been making decisions like this for thousands of years. We know what it costs, and we know what it takes to survive. The question is whether you're ready to learn." The weeks following Director Adams' revelation had transformed the Galactic Council from a deliberative body into a frantic war room. The elegant chamber where representatives had once debated trade agreements and territorial disputes now buzzed with the constant activity of military planners and intelligence analysts. The crystalline walls reflected the urgency of the situation, shifting between rapid patterns of red and orange that made some delegates dizzy. Captain Rivers stood on the bridge of the human starship Defiance, watching the sensor readings with growing concern. The ship was humanity's most advanced vessel, built using a combination of Earth technology and improvements learned from their galactic neighbors. Its hull was sleek and dark, designed for stealth rather than intimidation, and its weapon systems were hidden beneath panels that could deploy in seconds. "Captain," called Lieutenant Torres from the sensor station, "we're getting readings from the edge of the Kepler system. They match the energy signatures from the human data." Rivers moved to the central command console, her experienced eyes scanning the display screens. She had been in space for over 20 years, had participated in first contact protocols with 3 different species, and had commanded exploration missions to the farthest reaches of known space. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for this moment. "Range to contact?" she asked. "Approximately 12 million kilometers in closing," Torres replied. "Captain, the size of these readings are massive. Individual ships appear to be over 10 kilometers in length." The bridge crew worked with quiet efficiency, their training taking over as they prepared for humanity's first direct contact with the Void Fleet. The Defiance had been chosen for this mission because of its advanced sensor array and its ability to transmit data across galactic distances in real time. If something went wrong, the Council would know immediately. "Communications, open a channel to Council headquarters," Rivers ordered. "All sensor data is to be transmitted continuously. If we don't make it back, they need to know what we learned." The main display screen came to life, showing a view of space that looked normal at first glance. Stars dotted the darkness in familiar patterns, and the distant glow of the Kepler system's sun provided a reference point for navigation. But as the ship's sensors focused on the energy signatures, the view changed dramatically. The first ship of the Void Fleet emerged from the darkness like a nightmare given form. Its hull was a combination of organic curves and mechanical precision, as if someone had taken a living creature and enhanced it with technology beyond current understanding. Tubes and cables ran across its surface like veins, pulsing with an eerie green light that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the surrounding starlight. "My God," whispered Torres, her professional composure cracking for just a moment. "It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time." More ships appeared as the sensors adjusted to the new readings. They came in different sizes and configurations, but all shared the same unsettling combination of biological and mechanical elements. Some were elongated like massive serpents, others were squat and bulbous like deep-sea creatures, and a few had wings or tentacles that moved with purposeful grace through the vacuum of space. "Captain," called the communications officer, "we're receiving a transmission from the lead ship. It's not in any language in our database, but the universal translator is attempting to process it." Rivers nodded grimly. "Put it through." The bridge. Speakers crackled with static, then produced a sound that was unlike anything the crew had ever heard. It was part harmonic resonance, part electronic interference, and part something that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and speak directly to the brain stem. The universal translator struggled with the alien concepts, producing fragmented phrases that made little sense. Harvest. Potential. Conversion. Efficiency. Resistance. Toodle. The transmission cut off abruptly, and the lead ship began to change. Its hull plates shifted and rearranged themselves, revealing weapon systems that defied easy categorization. Energy began to build along the ship's spine, creating a glow that was visible even at their current distance. "They're charging weapons?" Torres reported, her voice tight with tension. "Captain, I'm reading energy levels that are off the scale. Whatever they're preparing to fire, it's more powerful than anything in our database." Rivers made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "All stop, ray shields. Prepare to transmit final sensor readings to the Council." The Defiance shuddered as its engines cut out, leaving the ship drifting in space like a mote of dust before an approaching storm. The crew watched in horrified fascination as the Void Fleet ships moved into formation, their movements coordinated with precision that suggested a shared consciousness. "Captain," the communications officer said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we're receiving priority transmissions from Council headquarters. They're ordering us to withdraw immediately." "Too late," Rivers replied, watching as the energy buildup on the lead ship reached critical levels. "All hands, brace for impact." The weapon fired, and space itself seemed to scream. The beam that lanced out from the Void Fleet ship was not just energy, but something that warped reality around it. Where it touched the fabric of space-time, stars dimmed and went out, and the background radiation of the universe seemed to pause in its eternal dance. The beam struck the Defiance's shields, and the ship's defensive systems held for exactly 3 seconds before failing catastrophically. The hull began to change, its molecular structure shifting and rearranging itself as the weapon's effect spread through the ship's systems. "Emergency evacuation!" Rivers shouted over the sounds of alarms and failing systems. "All crew to the escape pods. Transmit everything we've learned to the Council." As the crew abandoned ship, the Defiance continued to transform. Its hull became more organic, its systems more integrated, and its purpose more aligned with the Void Fleet's incomprehensible goals. Within minutes, the ship that had been humanity's pride was indistinguishable from the vessels that had converted it. The escape pods scattered in all directions, their occupants watching in horror as the Void Fleet continued its work. The ships moved toward the Kepler system with purposeful intent, their weapons beginning to target the planets and space stations that orbited the distant sun. Rivers activated her pod's communication system and sent a final message to the Council. "This is Captain Rivers of the Defiance. The Void Fleet is not interested in negotiation. They convert everything they encounter into resources or weapons. The Kepler system is lost. Recommend immediate evacuation of all systems along their projected path." The pod sensors continued to transmit data as the Void Fleet reached the inhabited worlds of the Kepler system. The process was efficient and ruthless. Planetary defense systems were converted into offensive weapons. Civilian populations were processed into raw materials. Even the planets themselves were gradually consumed, their mass converted into new ships for the fleet. By the time the escape pods reached the nearest Council outpost, the Kepler system was gone. Where there had once been worlds teeming with life, there was now only an expanding cloud of converted matter, and a dozen new ships adding their strength to the Void Fleet. The news reached the Council chambers within hours, transmitted through the quantum communication networks that connected the galaxy's major civilizations. The elegant debates about territorial boundaries and trade agreements were replaced by emergency sessions focused on survival. The species that had spent centuries perfecting the art of diplomatic warfare suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that had no interest in anything but consumption. Director Adams stood before the assembled council, her expression grim but not surprised. She had spent weeks trying to convince them that the threat was real, and now the evidence was undeniable. The Void Fleet was not just approaching. Their galaxy, it was already here, and it was hungry. "The Kepler system is gone," she announced, her words carrying the weight of billions of lives lost. Captain Rivers and her crew confirmed our worst fears. The Void Fleet doesn't want to conquer us or enslave us. They want to convert us into more of themselves. The chamber erupted in panic and recrimination. Some delegates demanded to know why humanity hadn't acted sooner. Others called for immediate evacuation of the outer systems. A few suggested that negotiation was still possible, that perhaps the Void Fleet could be reasoned with. "There will be no negotiation," Adam said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "There will be no surrender. There will be no mercy. They are not interested in our culture, our history, or our hopes for the future. They see us as raw materials, to be processed." She activated the chamber's display system, showing the final sensor readings from the Defiance. The images were clear and undeniable. The Void Fleet was vast, organized, and utterly alien in its purposes. "We have perhaps 6 months before they reach the core systems," Adams continued. 6 months to prepare for a war unlike anything this galaxy has ever seen. 6 months to decide whether we're going to face extinction as separate species or whether we're going to fight back as one. The chamber fell silent as the reality of their situation sank in. The peace that had lasted for millennia was over. The careful balance of power that had prevented major conflicts was meaningless. Against an enemy that respected no boundaries and sought no accommodation, "What do you propose?" asked Ambassador Thane, his reptilian features showing the strain. "Of processing this new reality?" Adams looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives from a dozen different species. "We do what humans have always done when faced with extinction. We fight, we adapt, we survive. And we make sure that our enemy understands the cost of threatening us." The war began 3 months later when the Void Fleet reached the outer colonies of the Galactic Council. The elegant fleets of the 12 major species, designed for ceremonial parades and the occasional border skirmish, proved utterly inadequate against an enemy that converted their weapons into additional firepower and their ships into raw materials for expansion. General Torres stood in the command center of the newly constructed War Council facility, watching the holographic displays that showed the progression of the conflict. The facility was built into an asteroid in a system that didn't appear on any public star charts, using human construction techniques that prioritized function over form. The walls were bare metal, the lighting was harsh and practical, and the air recycling systems made a constant low hum that reminded everyone they were in a hostile environment. "Status report," Torres ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. "The Hegemony's 4th Fleet engaged the Void Fleet at the Rigel system," reported Colonel Park, her aide-de-camp. "They lasted 16 hours before their entire battle group was converted. The enemy fleet has grown by approximately 30%. Torres nodded grimly. She had predicted this outcome when the Hegemony insisted on using their traditional battle tactics against the Void Fleet. Their ships were beautiful works of art, designed to intimidate opponents and demonstrate the superiority of their civilization. They were also completely unsuited for warfare against an enemy that treated every engagement as a harvesting operation. "What about the Silicon Collective's defensive line at the Vega system?" Torres asked. "Penetrated within 6 hours," Park replied. "The enemy adapted to their energy weapons faster than our projections suggested. High Counselor Vorn is requesting immediate evacuation of the core systems." The command center fell silent except for the hum of the life support systems. The assembled officers, drawn from a dozen different species, struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster unfolding across the galaxy. Everything they had been taught about warfare, everything their civilizations had learned over thousands of years of conflict, was useless against an enemy that operated by entirely different rules. "General," called Commander Stone from the communications. "Station, we're receiving a priority transmission from the council chambers." They're requesting your immediate presence for an emergency session. Torres looked around the command center, studying the faces of beings who had volunteered to work with humanity's military forces. They came from species that had once viewed humans as upstart newcomers, but desperate times had created unlikely alliances. "Colonel Park, you have command," Torres said. "Continue monitoring the situation and prepare contingency plans for the evacuation of the inner systems." The journey to the council chambers took 3 hours through hyperspace, giving Torres time to review the reports from the front lines. The news was universally bad. Every engagement with the Void Fleet had ended in disaster for the galactic forces. Traditional tactics of precision strikes and territorial control were meaningless. Against an enemy that consumed everything in its path, the council chambers had been transformed into a crisis management center. The elegant crystalline walls had been replaced with functional display screens showing real-time data from across the galaxy. The comfortable seating areas had been removed to make room for communication equipment and strategic planning tables. Director Adams met Torres at the entrance to the chamber, her expression showing the strain of weeks without adequate rest. "How bad is it?" she asked. "We've lost 12 systems in the past week," Torres replied. "The Void Fleet is adapting to our allies' tactics faster than we can modify them. At this rate, they'll reach the core systems within a month." They entered the main chamber together, finding it filled with representatives from every major species. The mood was one of barely controlled panic. Beings who had spent centuries in diplomatic negotiations were struggling to adapt to the reality of total warfare. Ambassador Thane stood at the central podium, his reptilian features showing signs of stress that his species rarely displayed in public. "General Torres," he said, his voice carrying a note of desperation, "the Council has voted to place all military forces under unified command. We need new strategies, new tactics, new ways of fighting an enemy that seems invincible." Torres walked to the podium, her boots echoing in the unusual quiet of the chamber. She had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, studying the history of human warfare and adapting those lessons for potential conflicts in space. Now she would have to convince a gathering of peaceful civilizations to embrace methods that horrified them. "Honorable members of the Council," she began, "you've been fighting this war with the assumption that your enemy shares your values. You've been trying to preserve infrastructure, minimize casualties, and maintain the civilized conduct of warfare. Your enemy has no such concerns." She activated the chamber's display system, showing tactical analyses from the recent engagements. "The Void Fleet doesn't distinguish between military and civilian targets. They don't care about preserving resources for future use. They don't negotiate, they don't retreat, and they don't show mercy. They are the ultimate expression of total warfare." The assembled delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The concept of total warfare was alien to most of them, a relic from the primitive periods of their civilizations that they had worked hard to forget. "What do you propose?" asked High Counselor Vorn, his crystalline form resonating with harmonics that suggested deep anxiety. Torres looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings who represented the finest achievements of galactic civilization. "We fight fire with fire? We abandon the rules of civilized warfare and embrace the tactics that humans developed over thousands of years of conflict." She changed the display to show strategic maps of the galaxy with red zones indicating the Void Fleet's advance and blue zones showing the remaining Council territory. "We implement a scorched earth policy. We deny the enemy resources by destroying everything they might want to convert. We evacuate civilian populations to protected systems and use the abandoned worlds as traps." The chamber erupted in protests and exclamations. The idea of deliberately destroying their own worlds was anathema to species that had spent millennia building and preserving their civilizations. "You're talking about the destruction of entire star systems," protested the representative from the Avian Confederacy. "The loss of art, culture, and history that can never be replaced. The alternative is conversion," Torres replied bluntly. "The Void Fleet will take everything anyway." At least this way, we deny them the resources and buy time to prepare more effective defenses. She changed the display again, showing weapon designs that made several delegates recoil in horror. We also need to abandon precision warfare and embrace weapons of mass destruction. Gravitational bombs that can collapse star systems. Biological weapons that can infect their conversion processes. Cyber warfare that can turn their own systems against them. Ambassador Thane's yellow eyes widened as he studied the proposed weapons. These devices could destroy entire civilizations. Yes, Torres agreed. And if we don't use them, the Void Fleet will destroy us first. This is what total warfare means. You don't fight to win territory or to impose your will. You fight to survive, and you do whatever it takes to ensure your survival. The chamber fell silent as the assembled delegates grappled with the implications of Torres' proposals. They were being asked to abandon everything they believed about civilized conduct, to embrace methods that their ancestors had rejected as too brutal for modern warfare. "General," said Director Adams, breaking the silence, "what do you need from U.S.?" Torres looked around the chamber one final time, knowing that her next words would change the course of galactic history. Complete authority over all military operations. The ability to requisition resources from any system. The authority to implement evacuation procedures without debate or delay. And, most importantly, the understanding that we are no longer fighting for conquest or territory. We are fighting for the right to exist. The vote was closer than Torres had expected, but the desperate situation left the Council little choice. By a narrow margin, they agreed to implement humanity's vision of total warfare against the Void Fleet. As the session ended and the delegates began to disperse, Torres remained at the podium, studying the strategic displays. The real work was just beginning. She had convinced the galaxy's leaders to embrace human tactics, but now she had to prove that those tactics could work against an enemy that had already consumed multiple star systems. Colonel Park approached the podium, carrying a datapad with the latest intelligence reports. "General, we're receiving preliminary reports from the Alpha Centauri system. The Void Fleet has entered the outer sensor grid." Torres nodded, her expression grim but determined. "Signal all fleet commanders. Operation Scorched Earth is now in effect. We're going to show the Void Fleet what happens when they threaten humanity and our allies." The holographic displays around the chamber began to shift, showing the movement of ships and resources as the galaxy prepared for a new kind of warfare. The elegant fleets of the Council species were being retrofitted with weapons that their designers had never imagined. Civilian populations were being evacuated to heavily defended fortress worlds. And in the spaces between the stars, automated systems were being deployed that would turn entire star systems into weapons if necessary. The Void Fleet had taught the galaxy about total warfare. Now humanity would teach them about the price of threatening Earth and its allies. 3 years had passed since the Void Fleet first entered the galaxy, and the war had transformed everything. The elegant civilizations that had once debated trade. Agreements in crystal chambers now huddled in fortified systems, their populations reduced to a fraction of their former numbers. The galaxy itself had become a battlefield, with entire star systems converted into weapons or sacrificed to deny resources to the enemy. General Torres stood on the observation deck of the battle station Prometheus, watching the final preparations for humanity's most desperate gamble. The station orbited Earth-Sun at a distance that would have been suicidal for any conventional vessel. Its hull shielded by technology that pushed the boundaries of known physics. Around her, the combined fleets of the surviving galactic civilizations waited in formations that would have been impossible to achieve 3 years earlier. "Status report," Torres ordered, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had commanded. "A galaxy-wide war for longer than any being should have to endure. The solar conversion array is at 97% readiness," reported Admiral Chun, her former aide who had been promoted to command the human fleet. "The Void Fleet's main concentration is still 3 days out from the heliopause. Intelligence suggests they're bringing everything they have for this final push." Torres nodded, studying the tactical displays that showed the approaching enemy. The Void Fleet had grown enormously since the war began, feeding on the resources of conquered systems and the converted remains of the galaxy's military forces. What had once been a collection of alien ships had become a swarm of interconnected vessels that stretched across light years of space. "They're not just coming to destroy Earth," Torres observed, watching the movement patterns of the enemy fleet. "They're coming to convert our sun itself. If they succeed, they'll have enough energy to fuel their expansion into neighboring galaxies." The war had taught the galaxy's defenders hard lessons about their enemy. The Void Fleet was not just a military force, but a form of life that existed by consuming and converting everything it encountered. Planets, stars, entire civilizations, all were nothing more than raw materials to be processed and incorporated into the swarm. Director Adams joined Torres at the observation window, her appearance showing the toll that 3 years of desperate warfare had taken. Her hair had gone completely gray, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who had made decisions that cost billions of lives. "The council representatives are asking for final confirmation of the plan," Adams said quietly. "Some of them are still hoping for a negotiated solution." Torres almost laughed, but the sound came out as more of a bitter cough. "After everything we've seen, they still think the Void Fleet can be reasoned with. We've tried every form of communication known to galactic science. We've offered them uninhabited systems. We've attempted to demonstrate our technological capabilities. We've even tried surrendering isolated colonies to see if they would show mercy. And every time they just converted everything and kept coming." Adams finished. "I know. But hope dies hard, especially when the alternative is what we're about to do." The alternative was Operation Solar Flare, humanity's final strategy for defeating the Void Fleet. It involved converting Earth's sun into a weapon of unprecedented destructive power, using technology that combined human engineering with scientific knowledge borrowed from every surviving species in the galaxy. The plan would work, the scientists assured them, but the cost would be the destruction of the Sol system and everything in it. "Evacuation status?" Torres asked. "The last transport left Luna 3 hours ago," Admiral Chun reported. "All civilian populations have been relocated to the Tau Ceti defensive line. Military personnel are down to essential crew only." Torres looked around the observation deck, noting the beings from a dozen different species who had volunteered to remain behind for the final battle. They had learned to work together during the war, their cultural differences set aside in the face of extinction. The elegant reptilian hegemony officers worked alongside the practical human engineers. The crystalline silicon collective tacticians coordinated with the intuitive avian confederacy pilots. War had accomplished what centuries of diplomacy had failed to achieve. "General," called Commander Rodriguez from the communications station, "we're receiving a transmission from the Void Fleet. It's the same message pattern they've used before." "Put it through," Torres ordered. Though she knew what she would hear, the bridge speakers filled with the alien harmonics that had become synonymous with the enemy. The universal translators struggled with concepts that seemed to exist outside. Normal language, producing the same fragmented phrases that had marked every previous contact. Conversion ... inevitable ... resistance ... inefficient ... The message cut off abruptly, replaced by the silence of space. Torres had heard variations of that transmission dozens of times over the past 3 years, and it never varied in its essential meaning. The Void Fleet saw all organic life as components to be integrated into their larger purpose. Individual consciousness, cultural identity, and species diversity were obstacles to be eliminated. "Visual contact with the lead elements," reported the sensor operator. "Distance 12 astronomical units and closing." The main display screen came alive with images of the approaching fleet. What they saw defied easy comprehension. The Void Fleet had grown beyond anything they had previously encountered. Its ships fused together into massive structures that resembled living organisms more than constructed vehicles. Tendrils of energy connected the various components, creating a network that pulsed with alien intelligence. "My God," whispered one of the Avian Confederacy observers. It's beautiful in its own horrible way. Torres understood the sentiment. The Void Fleet represented a form of evolution that was both fascinating and terrifying. They had achieved perfect unity of purpose, perfect efficiency of resource utilization, and perfect coordination of action. They were also utterly devoid of everything that made life worth living. "All stations, this is General Torres," she announced over the fleet communication network. "The enemy will be in weapons range in approximately 6 hours. All ships are to maintain current positions until my direct order. Remember, we only get one chance at this." The next 6 hours passed with agonizing slowness. The Void Fleet approached the inner solar system with the inexorable patience of a force of nature. They made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of urgency, and appeared to be completely confident in their eventual victory. They had, after all, conquered every system they had previously encountered. As the enemy fleet reached the orbit of Mars, Torres gave the order that would determine the fate of 2 galaxies. "Initiate Operation Solar Flare. All ships execute attack pattern Omega." The Prometheus and the other battle stations began their final approach to the sun, their hulls glowing white-hot as they entered the star's corona. Specially designed probes penetrated deep into the solar core, carrying gravitational charges that would destabilize the fusion processes that had burned steadily for billions of years. The Void Fleet responded immediately, their ships accelerating toward the inner system as they recognized the threat. But they were too late. The charges detonated simultaneously, creating cascading reactions that turned the sun into a weapon of unimaginable power. The solar flare that erupted from the star's surface was not a natural phenomenon, but a directed blast of energy that had been shaped and focused by human technology. It struck the Void Fleet like the hammer of an angry god, overwhelming their adaptive defenses and burning away the connections that held their collective consciousness together. Torres watched from the bridge of the Prometheus as the enemy fleet disintegrated under the assault. Ships that had seemed invincible moments before were reduced to component atoms by the unleashed fury of a star. The network of energy that had connected them flickered and died, leaving only scattered debris drifting in the void. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The solar flare consumed everything in the inner system, including the remaining human fleet and the planet that had given birth to their species. Earth burned away in seconds, its continents and oceans vaporized by temperatures that exceeded the core of the sun. Torres felt the Prometheus begin to break apart around her as the station's shields failed under the incredible energy bombardment. She had enough time to activate the emergency beacon that would transmit their final observations to the surviving fleets before the bridge disappeared in a flash of white light. The battle for Earth was over. The Void Fleet had been defeated, their main force destroyed and their remaining ships scattered across the galaxy without the collective intelligence that had made them so dangerous. But humanity's homeworld was gone, along with billions of years of evolutionary history and the birthplace of the species that had saved the galaxy. In the aftermath, the surviving members of the Galactic Council gathered in their new headquarters in the Tau Ceti system. The elegant crystal chambers had been replaced by functional spaces designed for the hard work of rebuilding a shattered civilization. The war had changed everything, including the beings who had fought it. Director Adams, now bearing the title of Secretary General of the Galactic Alliance, addressed the assembled representatives. Her words were broadcast to the refugee populations scattered across dozens of star systems, beings who had lost their homes but gained a new understanding of what it meant to survive. "The war is over," she announced, her voice carrying across the galaxy through quantum communication networks. "The immediate threat has been eliminated, but the cost has been enormous. We have lost worlds, civilizations, and billions of lives. We have been forced to abandon the comfortable assumptions of peaceful coexistence and embrace the brutal realities of total warfare." She paused, looking out at representatives from species that had been transformed by their shared struggle. The elegant reptilians now wore practical armor instead of ceremonial robes. The crystalline silicon collective had modified their forms for efficiency rather than beauty. The Avian Confederacy had adapted their ships for war rather than exploration. But we have also learned something valuable, Adams continued. We have learned that survival sometimes requires us to abandon our civilized pretenses and do what is necessary to protect what we hold dear. We have learned that different species can work together when faced with extinction, and we have learned that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would take it from us. The rebuilding process would take decades. Entire star systems had to be recolonized. New technologies had to be developed to replace what had been lost, and the psychological trauma of the war had to be addressed. But the galaxy's survivors had been forged into something stronger than what had existed before. Years later, when the first generation born after the war reached maturity, they would ask their parents about the time when humans had saved the galaxy by destroying their own homeworld. The parents would tell them about the species that had been willing to sacrifice everything to protect the freedom of others, and about the terrible price that sometimes had to be paid for survival. The galaxy remembered, and it would be ready the next time something emerged from the darkness between the stars, because humanity had taught them that sometimes the best way to preserve civilization is to be willing to fight for it with everything you have, even if it means losing everything you are.